Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I would like to talk about the fantasy novels that I have abandoned. I know that I've talked about it before, but when I was younger, I used to start writing fantastical novels and they never went anywhere. And I became the bane of one of my friends because I would regularly start things and she would critique them and then I'd abandon them. And she would say to me, "Why am I giving you my time if you aren't going to continue writing the books?" It became a thing of, if I wanted a critique, I had to wait until I'd finished writing the darn thing. One of the reasons I want to talk about this is because fantasy fiction was always the genre that I navigated towards when I was younger. And over the last few weeks, I have been heading back towards that with Sebastian de Castell, Robert Jordan, and a few books that I downloaded from BorrowBox. It's always been a favourite genre of mine. Although I have been a long lover of the fantasy genre, it isn't something that I actually first started out writing. I've said many times how the first novel I ever wrote was when I was 11 years old. It was about an adult spy, and I stole sex scenes from James Bond and my mum's Mills and Boon books because I thought that's what people wanted. I stuck with this idea for quite a while until I read Children of the Lamp, The Blue Djinn of Babylon by P.B. Kerr. This was a book series in which two young children discovered that they were genies. And looking back on it, I tried reading one a few years ago and there was a little bit of racism in there. There's a lot of problematic stuff that probably would get called out nowadays, but 20 years ago it was rife. I read The Blue Djinn of Babylon and I can remember starting writing my own fantasy children's book on Boxing Day 2005. I thought it was earlier than that, but I checked the dates. It was definitely Boxing Day 2005. I wrote a book with a protagonist called Nikolai Reader, and he basically discovered that his grandfather was evil and that he had the power to see the future. And by the end of the book, he'd actually gained control over all of the elements. His friend was a werecat. It was a mess. But all of my books when I was younger were a mess because I didn't used to plot them. I used to see things that I liked and suddenly they'd be in the next chapter. Well, I wrote continuously for 6 months until I finished that book. This set off my writing of fantasy novels over the next few years. I used to write a book every 6 months. I don't own any of them anymore, and I could not tell you what I wrote in that time. I joined a writing forum in 2006 called Teenage Writers. It no longer exists. It was taken over by somebody who banned all of the original users and what have you. But I didn't have the internet till 2007, so even though I joined it in 2006, I didn't really get a chance to use it until a year later. Over the last few weeks, whilst I've been reading fantasy fiction, I have been recalling certain projects that I have abandoned, and I want to talk about them here. And the one that I didn't think about till this morning, as I was trying to... I've got half a dozen here, and there were a few that came back to me this morning that I had completely forgotten. And the first one is the Weird Vampire Realm one. And the reason I'm calling it that is because I can only remember that I wrote a scene set in an alternative realm that was ruled by vampires. And there was a ruling faction of vampires who were like kings and queens. And then you had a mafia-style boss who was also a vampire who wanted to kill the princess. So the vampire princess was sent to the human realm and raised as a normal girl with vampiric tendencies. And the only way that you could tell that she wasn't maybe quite normal is that she took her tea with lemon instead of milk. And that's as much as I remember about this, apart from the fact that I planned 7 books. Each book dealt with her going between the vampire realm and the human realm and dealing with different wars that were breaking out. In one book, I can remember that she would have to have dealt with goblins because I can remember a cliffhanger type scene. I planned all of this out at my grandmother's in a notebook just like this. On A4. I have no idea where my plans for this went. I probably burned them because I was also terrible when I was younger and just burnt a lot of things. And I can remember that the 7th book would have ended with her sacrificing herself, you know, kind of like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But she was a vampire going and slaying vampires. It was to take over the realm. She was fighting this man to become the leader. He would disappear at one point when she vanquished him, but other people would fight to try and become rulers of the realm. And that was why each book was dealing with a different part of this realm, because a different fantastical creature was going to come and try and gain dominance over the place. I'm remembering it all now. But to save the realm, we would have this Buffy the Vampire Slayer type thing where she would sacrifice herself in the 7th book, and then we'd have an 8th book a few years later where she's magically resurrected hundreds of years in the future because they've decided she's just what they need to save the realm again. I mean, how many fantastical tropes did I steal for this series? I never even wrote the darn thing. I wrote 2 chapters. One where this mafia boss type vampire went through the palace and started slaughtering people, and she escaped to the real world. And then one set after school where she made herself a cup of tea with a friend. Anyway, after planning 8 books in this series, I never wrote it. That used to happen a lot as well. Once I'd written a plan, I'd end up thinking, well, now I don't want to write it because I know how it ends. Then we have The Clockmaker's Daughter, and I ended up adapting part of this for the Doctor Who project back in 2009 or 2010 with Jodie van der Wetering. So The Clockmaker's Daughter was set in a dystopian world where it had been taken over by clockwork people. It's exactly what it sounds like on the tin. They were basically robots that had armoured glass around their bodies and were powered by cogs. But you had Sophie, who was the main character on this series. Like, humans had taken to the seas at this point. And in this first scene that I remember writing, a man called Yorick, I used to write a lot where young women were being saved like Moses. Maybe because Exodus used to terrify me, it inspired a lot of my work. But he has saved this woman called Sophie. Well, she's a baby. Yorick has saved Sophie the baby and is taking her to a ship. And he is being chased by these clockwork men throughout the city as he tries to get her away. I think that the clockwork people were going to be taking Sophie hostage because they had been created by her father, obviously the clockmaker's daughter. Then basically she ends up on this ship and they were going to be fighting against the clock tower, who were the leaders of these clockwork people who had set themselves up as the rulers. It was going to be a trilogy. I can remember that in the 2nd book she was going to end up on a train that now travelled through the world. I actually think it was a train that was basically... Oh yes, so there was a train that travelled all around the world. I was like, how are the... As an adult, I'm like, how did the clockwork people not just start watching the trains? What's going on there? And then there was going to be another book where they went through the skies. That's all I remember about this series. Again, I wrote 2 chapters. I can remember her climbing a cliff and fighting some clockwork person whose face she smashed off to reveal the armour below. I gave up on this book after 2 months. Again, I planned an entire trilogy, but it didn't go further than that. What I used to do was I'd like come up with the climactic points and be like, oh my goodness, this is going to look so good when it's, you know, I'd get it into my head that it was going to be successful and adapted into a film and people are going to love it. That's how confident I was as a teenager. Anyway, that's when I gave up to write Shamanka Witch, which became Juniper Brown, which is the book that, as I say, I'm currently sharing the final iteration of that online. Then we have Shanti Uso. I remember nothing about this other than I'd been watching my cousin play Final Fantasy X at my nan's house and created this entire cast of characters that were humans and there were beast men. It was basically, if you look at the photo from Final Fantasy X of all the major players in that, then Shanti Uso was basically that. It was going to be a young woman who lives in a, not seaside town, she's by a lake, but it's people who basically live on the water in houses on stilts. and they built this entire world above the water. And she discovers that she can actually communicate with the water, and then there was going to be this evil rising that she would set out to fight against. There was even a character I remember creating who was part beast and played basketball, very much inspired by one of the characters in Final Fantasy X. Again, it didn't make it past 2 chapters, and I'm pretty sure that we never got further than a plan for this. Then we have the butterfly mirror, which stole from anime heavily, and was a character whose name I can't even remember anymore. It was probably incredibly racist on my part, because I didn't think about how problematic it was for me as a white person to be writing about a culture that I had never known anything about, who just happened to watch a lot of anime. I can't remember what the butterfly mirror was going to be used for. I do remember that we went to a different realm. There was a talking hippopotamus. There was somebody who had a magical transformation into armour as she fell down into a shaft. There was talk of the moon. There was a kingdom on the moon because of Sailor Moon. And I wrote 9 chapters of this. I remember that because the 9th chapter, I put it onto Teenage Writers and somebody commented and said how it read like an anime. And I was like, my work here is done. That's exactly what I wanted to achieve. And then I never wrote anymore. I watched a lot of Japanese media. I was thinking about the language. I was looking into the language. I was looking into the culture, and all of this. Really heavily inspired by that. It's probably a good thing I abandoned that one. Now we have a book. This is the first time the friend I told you about at the start of this video said to me, Charlie, you can't abandon this story. This sounds like a great story. It needs telling. And I was writing this story before I started uni, because we did a class in creative writing where we had to do, it was called Key Practices. And we had to share a writing journal at one point. And I said to my tutor, if I got permission, could I just hand in all of my IMs that I'd had with this friend that discussed the book Candlelight. I wish I could remember my protagonist's name right now. This book was inspired by Maria V. Snyder's, what was it called, Spyglass? It had glass in the title, I'm sure. It wasn't The Poison Study, it was the series that came after that. And I read the first book in that and was inspired to come up with this story called Candlelight. And this woman had been taken as a slave from a northern kingdom. Wherever she was taken, the ruler of that kingdom died, and as such, all of his slaves were buried alongside him. However, due to the fact that she was able to commune with spirits, which was what the people in her lands could do, her spirit guide led her out of this mausoleum where they buried the ruler. And she went on the run with this fox. And then we were in the woods in the beginning of this book. She came across that was it. So there was a guard who had been tasked with finding her. When they're in the woods, he ended up getting attacked. And the only way to save him was to transfer his soul into a candle. But when the candle burned out, that was it. He'd be gone, his soul would be lost. And she takes him back to the northern lands to save his life. She is welcomed back with open arms by her family, including the man who she was betrothed to marry all these years before. But she might have accidentally developed feelings for this guard. You know, classic young adult fantasy love triangle going on here. Somehow, these Northlands ended up getting invaded again, and they took both her betrothed and the guard away with them, and she would have to travel to the place where she was enslaved to save their lives. Through some awful things that happened, both her betrothed, who would be the villain of the piece, and the guard she's fallen in love with end up inhabiting the same body. And that would have been the climax. And then we would have moved into another 2 books that I can remember vaguely planning. And yeah, so my friend told me not to abandon this book. So naturally, I abandoned it. I'd finished Juniper Brown at this point, and I was querying that, and I was writing Our Doris alongside, and then I was writing George Peregrine as well, and Candlelight just kind of fell to the wayside and became this story that I would say, oh, well, I'm going to go back to it, and now we are 14 to 15 years later, and I don't talk about these books a lot, especially this next one that I'm going to get to, because in 2015, after I released Our Doris, I had the period of unfathomable sadness, and I put everything I'd written pre-2016 into a box, and I still haven't looked at that box in 8 years, so there's probably a lot of writing in there that will not be revisited, or one day I might, get the strength to go and read that one day and see what was in there. But recently, because of the fantasy fiction I've been reading, I've been thinking about a idea I had called cow dragons. And so basically, dragons had been domesticated in this world and were now livestock on farms. And this had come about because they were no longer being fed the mineral that turned them into these really smart, exceptionally large dragons. So it was almost like dragons had started out as these huge beasts, and through evolution and what have you, and men, they'd become these cattle basically. And so certain organs of theirs were taken to heat people's homes. They were used for food, their skin was used for armour. And then the mayor of this town, who's a little bit corrupt, decides that he wants to use dragons in a certain way to amass an army and take control. And in this, we were going to be following siblings throughout this country. One who was still on the farm, one who was now living in the capital, and one who was at an abbey. The abbey got attacked, and this woman who'd been going to go through her final initiation into becoming one of the sisters ends up imbued with a certain amount of magic that she shouldn't have been imbued with, and doesn't know how to use, because all of her sisters were massacred and nobody knew that she was gaining strength within this well. Meanwhile, this other brother who's in the capital ends up at this ball when this crime lord is murdered. So he ends up investigating that, and it turns into a murder mystery set in a fantastical world. We had the plot going on with the dragons, and we had the plot going on in the abbey, and eventually all of these things would have come together as it was revealed that they might all have been the machinations of a group of people who were looking to take over, and dealt with a lost grimoire and all of these other things. And it was going to be one book that had all of these different threads that all came together. But it was too big of an undertaking for me to write at the time, and now that I have so many other projects underway, I don't know that I'm ever going to get the opportunity to write it. It was certainly one that I was very invested in at the time, and creating characters and chatting to the friend that I told you about before, there were aspects that were going to be influenced by Celtic mythology. I thought it could have been great, but I've also always found it difficult to write fantasy fiction. As much as I enjoy reading fantasy fiction, I can never seem to transfer that voice across into it. I don't think that I've ever been able to have the serious tone that I felt necessary for fantasy. Now, I think, given the amount of cozy fantasy I've seen out there, I probably could have written it, but I never come up with... I have one cozy fantasy idea that I wrote 2 years ago for NaNoWriMo, and I didn't finish it, but I got a significant amount of the way into it, in which a man's dog was kidnapped by fairies, so he invaded the fairy realm to save his dog. But I do wonder whether fantasy fiction is just something now that if I ever do write it, it's just going to be one of those interesting fun side projects whilst I work on something more serious. Talking about them all now, like, there were only two that I think would have ever been able to progress anywhere. I think that it's always going to be a genre that I enjoy, but it's not necessarily a genre that I can write. And I think that that's okay. I mean, maybe I can't write any genre at all. Maybe I can't write at all. Maybe I've just been lying to myself all these years and just... But we can talk about that another time. But yeah, at the moment, I don't have any plans to write fantasy again, apart from the middle grade book that I'm just go and write the odd page or two here and there whenever I feel the need, away from the seriousness of the cozy crime, or when I need a break from editing. It's just like, we'll skip over here, we'll write a bit with these kids, and then we'll go back to the more serious matters of mistakes and murder over there. Well, that's me. Those are the books that I have abandoned, well, the fantasy novels that I've abandoned over the years. If I told you about all of the books that I've abandoned, we'd probably be here for about 50 years. Anyway, have you ever given up on a project? What are some of the embarrassing books that you came up with as children/teenagers? Because I know that they're going to be out there. If I have them, every single writer in the world has them. Those embarrassing books that we helped write, that we wrote to help us improve as writers when we were younger. Let me know in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.